Welcome to our fourth and final day of Positionality, a symposium on Latinx and Latin American art in Canada. Today we're joined by Tamara Toledo, who will be chairing today's session on decolonizing practices with Rodrigo, Luz, and Armando. I would like to start off the session by acknowledging that the land on which our gallery is placed on is the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. We acknowledge that the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. Today, the meeting place of Tekaranto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're very grateful to have the opportunity as immigrants and settlers to this land to work and present here. We also realize that today we're all coming from different regions throughout Canada, perhaps even Latin America or elsewhere. And this land acknowledgement only covers a small portion of unceded territories. I encourage you all to learn more about the land on which you are situated, the traditional ways of knowing and being prior to colonial impositions and genocidal practices. As a starting point, I recommend visiting native-land.ca. I will add the link to the website in the chat for you to take a look at it. And with that, I will pass it over to Tamara, who will get us started on today's session.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. I would like to thank all the participating panelists, volunteers, funders, partners, and interpreters that have made this symposium possible. I would like to especially thank Hannah, our operations manager, for her hard work and dedication towards the symposium. It has surpassed all expectations, and we are so pleased with how things have worked out and developed. I'm looking forward to this panel after we have witnessed for the past 3 days such engaging conversations within the symposium around themes of advocacy, collectivity, power, positionality, feminism, queer identities, feminist ideologies, all of which come from a decolonizing perspective. I have the pleasure in sharing this forum with 3 outstanding individuals who will have some time at the end of their presentations to answer any of your questions, and we will open it up for discussion at the end. But before I give the floor to them, I want to remind all of us that we are in a space of sharing, a space of respect, a space of collaboration, where I'm hoping interesting, fruitful, and honest conversations will be shared and valued. Please keep in mind that I will be keeping track of time, of the chat, and the Q&A, and I will try my best to get to your questions. So please feel free to write them down during the presentations or at the end. And since we are speaking of positionality, I would like to acknowledge that my position as the director curator of Sur Gallery, founder of Le Cap, and chair of this panel grants me the privilege to offer a voice to the often erased and silenced communities, specifically the Latinx and Latin American community. As a racialized, middle-aged woman who has fought for human rights since a very young age, coming from a refugee and exiled Chilean background with intergenerational trauma, and a resilient, combative, ancestral background, I am here to find spaces where there are none, and fight for the rights that have been cast in peripheral spaces of neglect. So with this in mind, I've framed the panels of the symposium as an opportunity to learn from each other, to engage in necessary conversations, and to end a cycle of erasure that coloniality has imposed on its ongoing patterns of domination. Neoliberal and capitalist systems within this modernity project we live in can and must have counter-hegemonic proposals. And through the panels we have witnessed, many participants have shared their forms of contestations with us. Our closing keynote speaker, Nelson Maldonado Torres, has explained, quote, decoloniality refers to efforts of rehumanizing the world, to breaking hierarchies of difference that dehumanize subjects and communities and that destroy nature, and to the production of counter-discourses, counter-knowledges, counter-creative acts, and counter practices that seek to dismantle coloniality and to open multiple other forms of being in the world, end quote. I hope that this symposium has offered all of us a glimpse of that attempt within Canada. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers in alphabetical sequence. So first, it is a pleasure to introduce Rodrigo Barrera, who is a designer, design curator, and creative director with over 30 years of experience in the arts, cultural, and social service sectors. He holds a master's in design and strategic foresight and innovation from OCAD University, located in the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, where he also lives. Rodrigo's current research practice focuses on the conception of speculative design principles through the intersections of Indigenous worldviews and practices and contemporary communications, strategy, and systems design principles. Rodrigo has been an active member of the diasporic Latinx community of artists and designers, a co-founder of Sur Gallery in Toronto, a visiting lecturer at OCAD University, and currently a senior manager of design at United Way Canada. Thank you, Rodrigo. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Sur Gallery, for this invitation. I hope that this presentation is a meaningful contribution to the conversations that we're having in this symposium. I will begin by sharing my presentation, and I'll read from my paper. Let me see. Just give me a sec here. My paper is titled Chile Design Strategies Against Neoliberalism. And basically with this, I want to just preface that for me, anti-colonial or decolonial practices really, especially from the perspective of Chile and the South, the global South, deal with, an anti-neoliberalist agenda, basically. So I'll begin reading right now. Chile's recent political history has been shaped by the emergence of neoliberalism. Its origins date back to the Klein-Sachs mission and exchanges between the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile and the University of Chicago during the 1950s and 60s. The military coup of September 11, 1973, not only brought an end to Allende's Chilean road to socialism, it also cemented a 16-and-a-half-year-long US-backed military dictatorship in which Chile served as a fertile lab for the Chicago Boys' experiments on monetarist economic theories, what Milton Friedman himself coined the Chilean miracle. In 1980, constitutional reform was designed to facilitate and legalize the mechanisms for neoliberal economic and political reform, including the privatization of natural resources such as copper, forestry, water sources, lithium, etc. These radicalized liberal economic adjustments could not have been imposed without what has been termed shock doctrines, meaning shocks to both the economy as well as to the psychological and physical state of Chileans. This heightened oppression and continuous intolerance is the human cost paid to redirect the country's economic model to this day. It is the tangible expression of radicalized capitalism, the Huérico disease described by Jack Forbes in 1992, the evolution of a colonial project which permeates, directs, and gives form to all living systems, individual, institutional, societal, as well as all aspects of life, including cultural activity. In this presentation, I analyze aspects of content and execution of three communication design proposals: the emergence of the muralist brigades of the 1960s, the No campaign of 1988, and street art and design of the 2019 uprising. I focus on shared characteristics and present oppositional consciousness, the concepts of chihi identity, and reconciliation as meta-concepts that may serve us as strategies for decolonizing practices. I will begin with the 1963 muralist brigades and the propaganda battles of España Avenue. 50,000 scholarships for poor children read a slogan on España Avenue in the port city of Valparaíso, painted during a night in May of 1963 by a crew sent from Santiago and paid by the Christian Democratic Party. The slogan, flanked by a giant white star over a blue square, served as Eduardo Frey's visual identifier during his 1964 campaign. The following night, supporters of socialist Salvador Allende responded with the slogan, "In the popular government, there will be no poor children." This was the beginning of a propaganda battle that signaled a series of important shifts in design strategy. First, the street became a contested public space for political art and design, a space previously dominated by the left. Second, mural painting became a collective performance, a conduit for political engagement and participation. Another important shift was ideological in nature. Popular movements and organizations began to use public art and design as supports to articulate and communicate their identity in opposition to dominant culture. The propaganda battles of España Avenue began to construct what Professor Chela Sandoval has termed oppositional consciousness. This is a consciousness opposable to mainstream identities, values, and worldviews. In 1960s Chile, mainstream worldviews may have been defined as reformist Christian social democratic, as a reactionary pro-American worldview, or as a revolutionary worldview, at the time captivated by the triumphant Cuban Revolution. Sandoval describes the concept of oppositional consciousness as a topography. In doing so, she emphasizes on the role place has in determining the psychic and material realities that, quote, delineate a set of critical points within which individuals and groups seeking to transform dominant and oppressive powers can constitute themselves as resistant and oppositional citizen subjects. These self-organized collectives of young Allende supporters turned muralist brigades developed a design vocabulary which inverted the values nurtured by centrist and right-wing propagandists. The dominant red, white, and blue used to reflect patriotism were defined with a vast array of hues created with the resources the brigades had at hand. The depiction of nation was opposed with human figures that interacted with animals, trees, flowers, mountains, water, a subconscious acknowledgement of self in relation to place. Their slogans found a common language in poetry and song, while the muralist brigades helped define the visual aesthetic and content of their emerging left-wing counterculture. These imaginaries were also reflected in the work of designers such as the Larrea brothers and of musical groups such as Inti Illimani, Quilapayún, and Iyapu, who reinforced the imaginary through lyrics, traditional instruments, and genres, giving way to what became known as the New Chilean Song. The muralist brigades played a crucial mass communication role, both during the 1970 presidential campaign that saw Allende become the first Marxist president elected in Chile, as well as in promoting the Popular Unity Government's program between 1970 and 1973. During this period, muralism progressively became part of an official art practice. In April and May of 1971, the brigades exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Santiago, and in November of the same year, artist Roberto Mata worked alongside the brigades on a mural celebrating the first year of the popular government titled The First Goal of Chile. The mural was located in a public pool in a working class neighborhood of Santiago. The same year, singer, songwriter, and dramaturg Victor Jara, an artist closely linked to the muralist brigades, composes For the Right to Live in Peace, which would become a symbol of the local and global anti-imperialist, anti-oligarchical, and anti-feudal youth movement against the war in Vietnam. During the military coup and throughout the military dictatorship, members of the muralist brigades would be actively persecuted. Forced to go into hiding, many young muralists continued their work in the underground pro-democracy movements in Chile or in the diasporic communities of political refugees around the world. Following his murder on September 16, 1973, Victor Jara became a symbol of song and art in active resistance. 1988, Chile, joy is on its way. The No Campaign slogan first aired on television on September 5, 1988. After mounting international pressure, the military junta conceded 15 minutes of television airtime a day to the government. Yes, a yes to the military regime, the continuation of the dictatorship on one side, and the No Coalition on the other. Following 15 years of brutal repression, the No Coalition campaign needed to combat an omnipresent fear towards overt political participation, while addressing an equally complex challenge: to mitigate the distrust and apathy of a generation that had come of age during the dictatorship and was receiving various and differing interpretations of what a return to democracy would or could mean. The government's campaign focused on portraying Pinochet as a civilian and furthering a narrative in which a return to democracy equaled a destructive, unpatriotic, and dark journey into Marxist violence and chaos. Meanwhile, the No Campaign's message focused on unity, on a Chile for all Chileans, and the joys of a spring that was on its way, arriving at the end of a storm. Its campaign symbol, a rainbow. This unity narrative needed to speak across generations, across class segments, gender identities, social and political affiliations. Emphasis was not placed on a return to democracy, which inferred the past, but that voting no meant the future, joy of living without Pinochet. However, everyone knew that that was a half-truth. Voting no would not do away with the neoliberal system imposed by the dictatorship or do away with Pinochet himself. The general would stay as senator for life. The No Campaign needed to construct a narrative that would serve as platform for various interpretations of dictatorship and democracy, to coexist within it. A sense of motley, which can be best defined by Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's understanding of the concept of chiqui, a concept counter to hybridity. Chiqui does not suggest the emergence of a third entity from the merging of two opposites, in this case, present dictatorship and future democracy, but the conflicted coexistence of these two or more elements that make up a third. From the perspective of a decolonizing practice, the concept of chiqui helps shed light on the world around us through a non-binary lens. Cusicanqui states, quote, "The notion of chiqui, like many others, reflects the Aymara idea of something that is and is not at the same time. It is the logic of the included third. A chiqui color gray is white, but not white at the same time. It is both white and its opposite, black." End quote. Chiqui is both differentiated elements and joint opposites. It is the identity created from juxtaposed components, in this context, dictatorship and democracy. Decentralized execution of a central message is another characteristic common to both the No Campaign and the muralist brigades of the 1960s. While the television spots communicated a central message, this was then co-opted by grassroots organizations to incorporate sectorial demands into the evolving vision of the future democracy and incorporate new voices to the campaign. This open source approach facilitated the participation of artists such as Los Prisioneros with the song The Dance of Those Left Behind, which reflected the sentiment of a youth neglected by the state, or Juan Downey's No video art piece, incorporating the Mapuche drumming and hinting at the pending debt that Chile had with its First Nations, while the appearance of female family members of the detained and disappeared dancing the cueca sola shed televised light on a long list of brutal human rights violations. You can only imagine the impact these accusations aired on television after 15 years of repression and censorship had. The campaign also synthesized and reflected back the diversity of design strategies and forms of anti-dictatorial struggle, both clandestine and officially permitted, that had taken place in Chile through the years and generations. This is the case of the inferred relation between CADA's no Mas public art actions of 1983 and 1988 no campaign images. As Juan Forge, one of the creatives behind the no campaign, states, quote, "Everything that was done in Chile had a vital importance to the result of the plebiscite. This was a 15-year marathon, and the no television spots were the final 100 meters. On October 5th, 1988, Chileans voted 56% in favor of the no option, marking the beginning of the end of General Pinochet's dictatorship." 2019, Between Rage and Hope, artistic expressions of the uprising. "It is not 30 pesos, it's 30 years," was the slogan chanted by thousands of high school students in the early days of October 2019. On October 6, exactly 31 years after the dictatorship's yes-no plebiscite of 1988, Sebastián Piñera's government announced a subway fare hike of 30 pesos in the peak hours of service. This was the last drop in a cup of indignities that could no longer hold the rage. After 30 years of democratic government administration of Friedman's Chilean miracle, people took to the streets to protest the growing inequalities and abuses. On October 18th, hundreds of thousands of people converged in public spaces throughout the country to demand an end to neoliberal economic policies. Susana Hidalgo's photograph is perhaps one of the most symbolic visual syntheses of a crucial characteristic of this new wave of protest. In it, a shirtless figure surrounded by a multitude waves the flag of the Mapuche nation over the statue of General Manuel Baquedano. Among the many issues ignored by the democratic government since the end of the dictatorship in 1990 are the ongoing struggle of the Mapuche nation for freedom and self-determination and the climate crisis. Without a doubt, the current social demand is not about 30 pesos, it is about 30 years of abuse. The demand of an end to neoliberalism coexists in tension with specific sectorial demands for a new ethos and worldview, what many have called a new social contract. Sectorial demands and system change converge in a Chicchi notion of the present and the future. Possible systems of a possible system that is emerging. As in the 1960s and as in 1988, the official messages and vernacular practices reinforce design strategies that are informed, created, and reproduced through transgenerational, cross-vindicative, and decentralized perspectives. But this time, they also reflect the urgency of what Professor James Tully has termed a dual crisis. One crisis being the devastating conditions of our human relations with other living beings, land, animals, flora, and the crisis being the current, and another crisis being the current relations between indigenous and non-indigenous people. Tully proposes that these two crises are interdependent, and that there can be no resolution to the crisis among indigenous and non-indigenous people without addressing the crisis of human beings with other living beings, and vice versa. On practices and discourses of decolonization, Kusikanki also talks to us of nonlinear constructs of indigenous conceptions of history. She states, "The contemporary experience commits us to the present, Ka Pacha, which in turn contains within it the seeds of the future that emerge from the depths of the past. The present is the setting for simultaneous lead modernizing and archaic impulses, of strategies to preserve the status quo and of others that signify revolt and renewal of the world." Pachacuti. In Chile, the reformist and revolutionary ethos of the teenagers that formed muralist brigades in the 1960s continues to exist alongside new collective and individual visual expressions. The 1980s dance of those left behind of Los Prisioneros and Victor Jara's For the Right to Live in Peace became the soundtrack of the 2019 uprising, expressing the rage and hopes of the new Chile they long for. Protests mimic a popular street festival in which traditional dance groups share space with popular comic strip characters and multitudes of women inspired by the performance art collective Las Tesis come together to denounce you, the state, are the rapist. The nightmares of corporate elites, military officials, and conservative politicians has come true. A perfect chaos inundates the streets. Eugenio Garcia, one of the creative directors of the 1988 No campaign, describes the 2019 social movement as a grand common sentiment of discomfort with what exists and an urgency for change. There is no one song that can interpret this. There is no one television spot that can interpret it. There is no one person that can interpret the complexity of this movement. This will not end with rewriting the Constitution. This is to say that this transformation goes beyond. It is a cultural and systemic transformation. I would like to conclude by reflecting on the various crises we are challenged with today. In doing so, I am reminded of an excerpt from the Haudenosaunee Treaty of the Two-Road Wampum Belt Agreement. It says, "Together we will travel in friendship and in peace forever, as long as the grass is green, as long as the water runs downhill, as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and as long as our Mother Earth will last." Today, large extensions of grass and forests have been decimated and are dying and drying. The water has been privatized and does not flow for everyone. And while we know that Mother Earth will last, we are left wondering how much longer it is able to sustain our irresponsible worldviews and lifestyle. There are signs of the urgently needed Pachacuti. The timeliness of this renewal and revolt is critical, and it is the participation of artists and designers in creating a non-binary, a she-he oppositional consciousness. Our viability on this land depends on our ability to decolonize and digress neoliberalism. This is one and the same struggle. I suggest that one place to begin is in exploring our past experiences, our past relations, our indigeneity. In all their complexity, they show us that contemporary design strategies against colonization and neoliberalism are proving to be transgenerational, plurinational, intersectional, and decentralized. They are the foundation of a new social contract. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. That was incredible, so fascinating how you have managed to link the world of design and activism using decolonizing methodologies and theories to understand and propose new modes of thinking and understanding, and how we can learn from this past and present in Chile, and will allow us to contextualize how we can incorporate that knowledge into our own realities, as you imply, inverting a system of power. I think there's a lot of room for discussion here, but we will leave that for the end. And so thank you so much for your contribution. I'm sure it will be a very engaging conversation. So now I would like to introduce Armando Perla, who is a consultant collaborating with museums, cultural institutions, and communities on issues of human rights and social inclusion in Canada and abroad. Perla holds a Bachelor of Laws from l'Université Laval in Canada and a Master of Laws in International Human Rights Law from Lund University and the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden. He was an assistant professor on decolonization and race in museums and heritage with the Master of Museum Studies, Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. Perla is founding team of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and the Swedish Museum of Migration and Democracy, as well as an international advisor of museums, human rights, and social inclusion for the city of Medellin, Colombia. He is currently pursuing a doctorate in art history and museology at the University of Montreal and is the chief curator for the Toronto History Museums. So welcome, Armando.
Gracias, Tamara. Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos. I want to start by acknowledging that I am connecting today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I also want to acknowledge that I am a mestizo from Cuscatán, the traditional land of the Nahua peoples, and that even though my dad's family are Nahua, I did not grow up in community because of the colonial legacy of El Salvador and its ruthless policy of assimilation. I also fled the same colonial violence because of my sexual orientation and arrived on Treaty 1 land and the heartland of the Métis Nation as an asylum seeker 22 years ago. Today, I want to talk about using subalternity, something that I'm very familiar with, as a curatorial practice inside the very Western and colonial institution of the museum, and how we can appropriate this space to tell our own stories. Jacques Derrida and Walter Mignolo both have expressed that it's not beneficial to antagonize non-Western and Western forms of knowledge, but that instead the idea is to appropriate positive contributions of Western philosophy and unravel them from coloniality. The concept of autoethnography, as coined by Marie-Louise Pratt, also speaks to this idea of appropriating the contributions of the West by the subaltern. She describes the autoethnographic text as a text in which people undertake to describe themselves in ways that engage with representations others have made of them. Thus, if ethnographic texts are those in which European metropolitan subjects represent to themselves their others, usually their conqueror others, autoethnographic texts are representations that the so-defined others construct in response to or in dialogue with those texts. Autoethnographic texts are not then what are usually thought of as autochthonous forms of expression or self-representation. Rather, they involve a selective collaboration with and appropriation of idioms of the metropolis or the conqueror. These are merged or infiltrated to varying degrees with indigenous idioms to create self-representations intended to intervene in metropolitan modes of understanding. Autoethnographic works are often addressed to both metropolitan audiences and the speaker's community. Their reception is thus highly indeterminate. Such texts often constitute a marginalized group's point of entry into the dominant circuits of print culture. Moreover, she argues that autoethnography often involves collaborations between different peoples, and that in recent decades, autoethnography, critique, and resistance have reconnected within writing in a contemporary creation of the contact zone, the testimonio. Ana Forcinito describes testimonio in the Latin American context as a narration marked by the urgency to make public a situation of oppression or injustice and or of resistance against that same condition, and therefore a narrative that accounts for the construction of collective subjects and emphasizes agency. It is also used to refer to a narration that reveals the urgency to bear witness to an event or series of events perpetrated with the aim of eliminating a community or a group, a narrative linked to documenting human rights violations and genocide. The narration, mediated or not through an editor, entails the affirmation of a speaking subject who in turn invokes the existence of a community or group to which she or he claims to belong. Testimonio is generally associated with the term subalternity, and thus is understood as an attempt to undo the erasure within official narratives of the existence of a social group and its culture, as well as of the actions implemented by that group in order to struggle against oppression. Even though Testimonio is often identified as a literary production, in her PhD thesis, Reading Testimonio Today, Central American Literature from 1982 to the present, Indo-Canadian scholar Upsana Takar argues that Testimonio is above all a perspective from which to read a literary text. It is one way among many to understand or interpret a text. Takar further explains that she reads contemporary fiction and film from Central America, especially El Salvador and Guatemala, as testimonio, with a focus on aspects such as parity, transnationalism, and visuality. Similarly, Professor of English and Latina Studies, Ela Diaz, in her article, Seeing is Believing, Visualizing and Performing Testimonio in Chicana and Latino Art, proposes the idea that performance can also be interpreted as testimonio. She argues that to perform a literary genre, and particularly testimonio, challenges the written practices and conventions of academic disciplines, namely Latin American studies and literature fields and Chicana Latina studies. What is central in all of these interpretations is that testimonio serves as a way to center the voice of the subaltern, to denounce oppression and to resist erasure. This is important because the social location of the subaltern generates a type of knowledge that those in the ruling groups do not have access to. Making use of feminist standpoint theory to contest objectivism, Sandra Harding argues that taking the social location of the subaltern as a starting point in research processes can grant access to the type of knowledge needed to see dominant conceptual projects from a causal critical view. She tells us that objectivism insists that the only alternative to its view from nowhere are special interest claims and ethno-knowledges that can be understood only within a relativism epistemology. However, institutionalized power imbalances keep starting off from the lives of those who least benefit from such imbalances, a critical edge for generating theoretically and empirical more accurate and comprehensive accounts. Feminist accounts of marital rape, sexual harassment, women's double day of work, or women's different and valuable forms of moral reason are capable of conceptualizing phenomena that were there heretofore invisible because they start off from outside the dominant paradigms and conceptual schemes. Similarly, Mignolo affirms that it is this marginality, what he calls the colonial wound, what enables the subaltern to see what those in the circles of power cannot. The colonial wound corresponds to the fact that regions and peoples around the world have been classified as underdeveloped economically and mentally. Starting off from the social location of the subaltern is also what our keynote from Friday night, Kenzie Cornejo, has called a Wanaka-Hood point of departure, which, as expressed by Harding, is also a necessary step to strengthen objectivity. Thus, instead of weakening objectivity by trying to attain an impossible sense of neutrality, by embracing a geopolitical consciousness as a starting point in the research or curatorial processes, we can work towards achieving a strong objectivity. So, how can we use testimonial and this subalternity and as a form of curatorial practice? And describing what decolonization and the museum sector means to her, Indigenous museum professional Paul White Kearns eloquently gives us an insight into what this work might look like. She tells us that Indigenous curators and exhibition makers will continue to push to determine how our stories are told and not have those stories told for us. So while I don't desire to reform the whole museum, she tells us, I do want to see more sophisticated narratives about the multiple lived experiences of what it is to be Maori, authored by Maori. I want to see insightful interrogations into what decolonization looks like to an Indigenous person and an Indigenous community, as declared by Indigenous communities. These are important conversations to be had within the museum because, as the quote above states, Hiwara Korero Tonu, we are still a site that spurs discussion, but decolonization processes will hopefully ensure that the immediate benefits of those conversations are for the community and not for the institution, that we won't continue to be spoken about in third person. This will be my version of decolonization, Kearns tells us, putting the people at the center and not the interest of the colonial machine. Similarly, in its latest report on repatriation released in October 2020, the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples affirms that museums must develop relationships of collaboration and trust and seek out and respect Indigenous peoples' knowledge, protocols, traditional laws, and customs regarding items in their collections. Stakeholders such as UNESCO, the International Council of Museums, the Expert Mechanism, the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples can assist museums in advancing a human rights-based approach to these issues and achieving a better understanding of their legal and ethical obligations and of indigenous peoples' expectations and worldviews. Partnerships of this type are essential in order to decolonize museums. So a human rights-based approach is a conceptual framework based on international human rights standards directed to advance human rights. A human rights-based approach promotes empowering people, especially the most marginalized, to participate in all processes and phases of a project and to hold accountable those who have a duty to act. Under this framework, human rights are not considered just one element of decision or dimension in mainstream processes. They constitute the foundational framework and basis for the entire process of socio-political organization and development. The expert mechanism has also noted that moving towards a human rights-based approach may therefore require a dramatic shift. In many instances, this transition begins with museums exploring cooperation with indigenous peoples as constituents, employees, and stakeholders. As museums increasingly embrace indigenous peoples' cultural rights along with repatriation, they are also able to develop more extensive relationships, better information about collections, and collaborative programming consistent with museums' current goals to be inclusive, diverse, and relevant to today's societies. I'm going to share my screen now so I can show some images of the work of some of the artists that are part of an exhibition that I will be talking in about a second. So, Imborrable, La Tierra de Nuestras Memorias, an exhibition on historical memory funded by the United Nations Development Fund, UNDP, to build capacity when the Ministry of Culture of El Salvador has attempted to utilize human rights museology and children's museology to center the human in its development process. For us, as a curatorial team with 1 international and 2 local members, this exhibition represented an opportunity to invite children, families, artists, and activists to help us build a collective and fuller version of history that includes the voices of those who have been historically excluded from official narratives in El Salvador. This has also served as a way for us to appropriate the museum and museological work to tell our own stories in our own terms. In a country where organized violence and state repression have escalated to levels never seen since the signing of the Peace Accords in 1992, with 40 assassinations taking place in 3 days in November of 2021 and 60 more occurring in a single day in March of 2022, developing an exhibition on historic memory in a co-creation process has represented several challenges. Nonetheless, as a curatorial team, we made the conscious decision to include the meaningful participation not only of children and their families, but also of artists and activists that have also publicly called out state repression in El Salvador. We also decided to include the participation of war survivors and victims of torture. This provided an opportunity for these groups to take ownership of the exhibition development process and for them to tell their stories in their own terms. At the same time, this process also meant fulfilling some of the legal obligations towards ex-combatants that the state has yet to fulfill, reintegration, mental health care, and others. From beginning to end, this process of exhibition development has also included the involvement of an art therapist and a psychologist specialized in trauma to ensure the minimization of harm and to ensure that responsible and ethical approach to the implementation is followed. Additionally, through this project, the team is providing a platform for children to work directly with war survivors to co-develop an educational tool that can help former political prisoners to share their experiences of the war with younger audiences, hence facilitating intergenerational dialogue and resisting the denial and erasure of the Salvadoran armed conflict currently advanced by the government. Moreover, by bringing together indigenous, Black, queer, and women artists and activists, this exhibition also tries to serve as a bridge and as an opportunity to foster coalition building based on affiliation politics for many of these groups that are looking for structural change in El Salvador.
Thank you so much, Armando. That was amazing with your presentation around testimonio, how important that is to use as a method for curatorial practice. really resonated this notion of not talked about in the third person, and how relevant that is in order to decolonize the museum, the curatorial space. And how interesting it is that you come from a human rights and lawyer background, and how that informs your practice today. You know, interrogating the institutional space with its deeply problematic histories, in their collecting practices and connections to colonialism, and how one operates within that colonial legacy. So thank you so much for your presentation, and I'm sure we will have a lot of discussion at the end around that. And so finally, I would like to introduce our last panelist, Luz Sierra, who is a Boricua arts professional focused on photography and art history. Her professional interests are creating accessible projects to foster community engagement through photographic archives and museum collections. Her research interest is to trace photographic materials of the Caribbean region and place them within new queries of neocolonial historical narratives. She holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in photography with a minor in Western art history from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. Currently, Sierra is pursuing a Master of Arts in Photography, Preservation, and Collection Management from X University in Toronto. So welcome, Luz Sierra. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much for your introduction. Before beginning and before sharing my screen, I would like to thank you all for being here. And also I would like to thank Sur Gallery for this event, and also to congratulate my fellow panelists for sharing their work and their ongoing projects. So I'm going to share my screen right now. 1 second, please. So today I'm going to share the approach that I've been taking to catalog and intellectually organize a photographic historical collection from the Circum-Caribbean. I have titled my thesis project, Knock on Wood, creating a dissenter finding aid for the Montgomery collection of Caribbean photographs. Before we start, I would like to let you know in advance, this presentation has some photographs with discriminatory connotations that were wrong now and are wrong, that were wrong day and are wrong now, sorry. So it is very important for me to first locate and position ourselves to understand the geography of where the collection was created. This will also help to show the geographic scope that I selected for this applied thesis project. The compilation of the collection began in 2005 by the American archivist and documentarian Patrick Montgomery. Patrick acquired photographic prints and objects from galleries, antique stores, auction houses, and e-commerce corporations for over 11 years, and categorized them into carefully considered subsets based on geographic location, recurrent themes, photographic materials, and photographers. The collection was then acquired by the AGO in 2019. Based on TMS record, the collection consists of 3,868 items that date from around 1840 to around 1940, and are from the Circum-Caribbean, which is the region that you're seeing in the map right now. This includes the eastern part of Mexico, Central America, and the northern area of South America. The Art Gallery of Ontario has preserved the original order of the collection, and it is housed in the Martin Gilbert Print and Drawing Center. So, what was my first approach? Given the vastness of the collection, I knew that I could not take it all in approximately 6 months. So I reduced the scope to the predominantly Spanish-speaking geographical spaces. I then chose the earlier date period in the collection because the year 1840 traces the historical beginning of photography and the use of the medium as a colonial tool. while circa 1890 is before the Spanish-American War that occurred in 1898 and shifted the economy and social-political relationship of the territories and countries of the Circum-Caribbean. Here is a close-up of the selected scope for the thesis project. I have selected the northern half of the Caribbean archipelago, including the countries and territories Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, Cayman Island, and Puerto Rico, collectively known as the Greater Antilles, as named by European colonists. And I also included Bahamas, Bermuda, and Turks and Caicos. How can we decenter and migrate collections to new finding aid when they were previously cataloged under colonial legacies? This question has helped me ground through this process and also to list the tools that I need for the project and define the purpose, which is to intellectually organize the Montgomery collection of Caribbean photographs in a bilingual English-Spanish finding aid to improve the collection's accessibility. For my thesis, I have positioned the photograph in parallel with the inward history of the territories and countries. My take on this project is to create a finding aid that facilitates access through geographic location, makers, formats, and subject matters. I predict this level of organization will benefit both researchers specializing in Circum-Caribbean histories and subjects, and non-specialized community users whose scope can begin with a geographic interest. I have divided my thesis project into 3 parts. The first part is the catalog of my narrowed down selection of materials. I have cataloged the materials following the AGO standards, and some other decisions have been made through cataloging to create consistency for such a varied collection in the finding aid, which I will discuss in the next slides. The catalog will include the maker, date, location, dimensions, medium for each object and image, and a thorough research on selected photographers. The second part involves arranging the selected materials in a logical order by geography, dates, photographers, subject matters, and photographic materials. The third part is the translating of the English finding aid into Spanish in a way that encompasses and honors the nuances of the Circum-Caribbean indigenous words in Spanish Taino. I have completed what has been done to date. I have completed reviewing a total of 1,138 selected materials. Currently, I'm fully hands-on with the written component, and will continue with the research for the finding aid and reviewing the catalog material. The collection was not fully digitized, so I have completed the task of cataloging and photographing the items box by box, working with the collection in person and describing the selected material in an Excel sheet. Additionally, research on the items is ongoing. Future plans are being made for the collection to be digitized, including the related documents and of materials from the acquisition and that accompany the acquisition. Some of the cataloging decisions for the finding aid that have been made, for example, are the titles. The titles are being generated from the inscriptions or marks on recto or verso in the materials. If there is none, the title has been descriptive. The text in orange are the changes that I have made. Sorry. This one. My apologies. There it is. We have to recognize the material was created and disseminated under heavily racist social placement of the otherness. Therefore, racist or derogatory inscriptions and marks are part of the materials, as the materials are a reflection of Western-centric viewpoints of that time. I have used the acronym SIC to identify and recognize the existing discriminatory context, and this will advise the reader that it wasn't generated from the current collection holder, the AGO. It's a text. The changes are in the text in the color orange that you see on the screen. And recognize the existing discriminatory context, and this will, as I mentioned, this will advise the reader. As you see, again, It's the orange text. For the subject matter, the descriptive words are generated based on the photograph content and title. I have been consulting the Getty thesaurus and also as a tool, Google Trends, but I have also reached out to researchers who have seen the collection in order to open a dialogue with them about subject matter descriptions and to also be more responsive to the actual research community. The text in blue are subject matters from the Getty and evaluated with Google Trends. And the text in reds were generated from the research in contact and from my own research. I open quote. The Caribbean is the epicenter of the modern world, close quote. That's what the Jewish American anthropologist Sidney Means said. And this gave me a starting point of interest to contextualize the Caribbean. Although Mint's work is in regards to the colonial exploited economy, I want to stretch this premise and trace further back to the notion of collections and archives in the Caribbean, which from the Western perspective began in 1538 with the first university in the Western Hemisphere was founded in the Dominican Republic by the Spaniards. I want to continue the post-colonial conversation of modernity as a series of disruptive laboratories, and some of significant dates that I have in mind while reviewing the collection and writing the historical scope are the Haitian Revolution of 1825, as well as the Emancipation Act of the British West Indies and colonial territories of 1833 and its enactment in 1838, 1 year before photography was announced. The photographs in the collection, to some extent, do not reflect the internal conflict or progress within the local countries and territories. Instead, they visually frame the region's colonial history and their economies of leisure, in addition to how photography was used to convey a vision. The role of reviewing historical material, as Ariela Aicha Azulay states, it is not to confirm what it is, but the role they play in this enterprise. This collection adds one of many missing pieces, the puzzle memory of the Circum-Caribbean history, and leave more space for so many inquiries about the content in the photograph, their dissemination, and their placement in a neo-colonial history. To this date, I'm still in the process of beginning the translation simultaneously with other tasks that are still developing, such as shaping the subject matter as close as possible to current research inquiries. Working hands-on with this collection has been a learning curve, especially understanding in-depth materiality and context. Having an aha moment, this is from the 1840s and 1860s. I feel very closely linked to the content of this photograph. It runs to every fiber of my being, as this collection's geography is the same land that I call home. And in words of Fortunato Vizcarrondo and Esteban David, I'm constantly looking to answer the question, ¿Y tu abuela, a dónde está? Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Luz. That was incredible work that you're pursuing through your thesis, your master's, and I congratulate you for such necessary work. You work within the confines of archives and academic institutions, and it's so refreshing to hear about scholars who attempt to decolonize these spaces that are filled with harmful colonial legacies. You instead propose new modes of interacting with these legacies of coloniality. Thank you so much for such an enriching and interesting, important contribution and approaches to decolonial approaches. Despite having different approaches, all of you contribute and offer important decolonizing perspectives and practices. We are all trying to navigate this difficult and challenging territory of coloniality within the global north, where we live with and face multiple barriers. As as curators, scholars, researchers, we all have lived experiences, interests, and knowledge that have at times, we've been excluded and marginalized from mainstream canons and many times victims of systemic racism. I wanted to ask all of you if you could share or expand on your life experiences, and Luz hinted at that, your positionality within Canada. Maybe expand on that, Armando, how you see yourself and how this has marked or influenced your personal journey. Perhaps Luz can begin, Armando, and then Rodrigo.
Okay, just to rewind, your question was about my positionality at this moment.
Yeah. I mean, you hint at that at the very end of your presentation, and how your position as a Puerto Riqueña, how that's influenced the pursuit of your project for your thesis, for example, and the interests that you have.
Well, it's very complex, but where to start, where to begin? Definitely, where do I position myself? I as coming from a tiny island to this big geographic space that it's called Canada, and I have to distance. I will say I have learned to distance, to analyze and to critically view and to critically see the differences between what it's approaching the history of the Caribbean. I'm so sorry. Approaching the history of the Caribbean with the historiography that it has been teach in Spanish, first of all, and then having this other side of learning how to decolonize and to overview the history that I learned in Spanish, and that has been my placement. And I will have I have distanced myself to just critically view from the other side. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. That would be my quick and short response.
Thank you. Armando?
Yeah, I think that question is really interesting, right? Particularly for us as immigrants here, which we kind of like live in these two worlds, right? So like the way that I see myself is like sort of this like transnational pollinator like bee, right? Because I keep going back and forth between Latin America and coming back here to North America and trying to understand the differences between the two approaches to decolonization in these two parts of the world is really important because they are different, right? And so, for instance, when we look at what decolonization means in sort of like the Kansas states, which is, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, US, we're usually talking about like the decolonization is not a metaphor, right? Like, young and tuck, and taking of the land back, and the not recognition of the legitimacy of the nation state or the governments that we're living, right? Like we're trying to dismantle the state, we're trying to dismantle the government. When we exist in Latin America, if we look at it from the legal point of view as well, it's completely different, because this idea of asking for the land back is never going to work out. Like the repressive governments of Latin America aren't going to engage in dialogue with indigenous peoples to keep the land back. Like that's just not possible, right? And this dichotomy became really apparent, of course, during the negotiations of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, where indigenous peoples from the Kansas states were asking for that decolonization approach to land back, and indigenous peoples from, Latin America, Africa, Asia, even Northern Europe, were saying we want a human rights approach. But when you ask for a human rights-based approach, you're actually recognizing the legitimacy of the state. So as apparently in opposition, right, to the taking the land back and dismantling the state. So how do you reconcile those two? And that's kind of like, I think, how I feel many times existing in these two worlds. It's like, how do you reconcile, like what we are doing and learning in Latin America with what we're doing and also practicing here in this part of the world? And sometimes there is really not an answer to it, and sometimes there are. And so I'm still trying, I'm still in that journey of trying to understand what it means to be a Latin American immigrant, queer, mestizo, asylum seekers, all of those identities, right? Like living with HIV, like all of these different things that make me who I am, and in these two different contexts as well.
Thank you, Armando. Rodrigo?
Yeah, I found it interesting that Luz, one of the first things she said was, you're asking about my positionality right now, right? And I think that's interesting because I think positionality changes through time, and as you, have different experiences, are situated in different contexts. So as an immigrant, I think from a very early age, when I left Chile, I think I positioned myself fundamentally as a Chilean, as a left-wing Chilean. And you might think, well, yeah, but you were only 7. Yeah, but it was different times. Even at 7-year-olds, you knew that you were left-wing and you were Chilean, right? And that's how you kind of position yourself, or at least that's how I positioned myself. When I started sharing experiences with Nicaraguan friends, with Salvadorian friends that were migrating from, the wars in their countries in the early 80s, I began to identify more as a Latin American, right? My positionality began to kind of shift, right? The experience of going back home, going back to Chile in 1984 until the end of the dictatorship in 1989, also marked, kind of how I understood my position, primarily because I was no longer a 7 years old, and it was my decision to make as to whether I was going to stay in Chile, right, or leave the country to try to settle again or establish myself again in Canada. And so I self-identify myself as a colonized settler. And again, I think it's complicated, but I'm trying to also kind of look through the lens of the Shihi identity, right, and concept, to actually understand that I could be all of those things. I could be Chilean, Latin American, immigrant, a settler, and a colonized individual, right? And that's just the beginning. Like if we look back at our roots, personally, as a family, as a community in Latin America, this hybridity, this Shihi identity of the mestizo is so ingrained in it. So I'm just kind of starting to scratch the surface, right? And I know that in there I have, indigenous roots, European roots, African roots, right? Like most Latin Americans. And that's kind of like going to be my journey, right? Trying to understand my indigeneity, right? But right now, as Luz would say, right now, my positionality, I guess, would be of a colonized settler. That's how I identify.
Thank you. Such diverse responses to that question. Thank you so much. We do have one question in the Q&A that I would like to address from Margie Rauen. Thank you so much, Rodrigo, Armando, and Luz. Each of the talks made me feel how urgent it seems for teachers to hear you, and how your work, as the work of previous speakers, could inform better educational practices, which could thrive on the collections, performances, and approaches you shared. Have you considered pursuing collaborations that would lead to promoting the discussion of colonialism in the curriculum? who would like to respond to that?
I can start with that. And you'll see how honest I am about these things. Well, as you heard probably from my bio, right? Like I was working with the U of T before becoming chief curator for the Toronto History Museums. And I came to the University of Toronto because I started talking to students, and students started reaching out to me because, yes, universities are teaching what I am doing. And the students could not see themselves, or particularly racialized, that students could not see themselves reflected in their faculty, right, or the curriculum and what they were doing. So I ended up receiving an offer from the University of Toronto to come and exactly do that, to help them decolonize, their curriculum. The issue is that they are not interested really in decolonizing themselves. The issue is that there is so much resistance and so much toxicity inside of academia. Like museums are toxic and horrible, but like academia is like a whole other level, right? And so the issue started with the point that you bring me into a university, into this thing, and there's like, I did not understand all these hierarchies, like back then that I accepted, but I didn't understand that actually being a teaching stream, it's being like the lowest of the lowest of the lowest. And that you had me in a 3-year contract and you expect me to build relationship with communities for you to decolonize your curriculum, but that makes no sense, because to build relations with communities, to do this decolonizing work, you need to be there for those communities and you need to be accountable to them, right? But what happens if my contract is not renewed after those 2-3 years? How am I going to be able to be accountable? And how is the program going to be accountable to all those communities that you're trying to bring in and extract that knowledge so you can decolonize your curriculum? And so there is really no willingness, like I said, inside of most institutions to do this work. And unfortunately, like as much as I enjoyed, working with the students, and I still continue to do that work, informally mentoring, but it is just too toxic. And there is a point when you decide, what is it? Like, is it best for me to stay here or just to move on? And I think moving on is what is needed. And what I said as well is that you cannot say that you're going to decolonize your curriculum and teach students how to decolonize museums when you haven't even started doing the work yourself inside. And so I think there is a lot of work that needs to take place in there.
Thank you, Armando. Margie Rowan says, truly, Armando, the Brazilian context poses toxic relationships too. Thank you, Armando. Yes, thank you, Armando, for your insights, says Sebastián Oreamuno, to your response. Most institutions have been slow to respond to a call for change. They've been saying that they want to change, but they've been, as you state, Armando, truly don't want to decolonize their spaces or institutions. I have a question, if there are no other questions from the audience. Do you find there is a contradiction from your position of power and privilege? You are all educated in your Western universities. You're involved working in these institutions. How do you navigate this potential contradiction? Maybe we can start with Rodrigo. Maybe you can all answer to that question.
Yeah, I also will kind of go back and forth with the previous question and this one, because I think they're also linked. But I think it's quite clear that I carry a lot of privilege. As a male, primarily white, right? Educated, there's a lot of privilege there for sure. At the same time, I haven't had access to the privileges that others have had, right? I think the way I would answer this question is that it's, I think it's important to think about our intent, right? Our intent and the impact that we have in the spaces that we occupy, right? So going back a little bit to the previous question, I completely agree with what Armando was talking about. But that said, at Oakland University, for example, which is where I studied, and I studied advertising. So imagine, the other layer of privilege that there is there. I never worked and I was never hired by an advertising agency, but I studied advertising, right? But at Oakland University, where I studied and where I kind of hold most of my academic kind of relations, there is, I think, an interesting intent to decolonize the curriculum, right? Through very kind of specific measures, like the cluster hires, for example, and for an openly, kind of a discourse around decolonizing art and design, right? Perhaps the fact that it's also an art and design institution helps, right? But we still face all of those challenges. The blocking of the process, the ill-intentioned kind of discourses that are not, really a decolonizing practice. They're just looking to basically, get with the times and make money out of it, and jump on the bandwagon, etc. Right? But I think we have to also situate our own relationship, our own journeys, in the context of the greater journey. And these are situations, these are harmful systems that have been in place for so many decades, centuries, right? That I think it's obviously going to take time to deconstruct. And we obviously, it's not going to take as long, hopefully not as long, to deconstruct as it meant to put in place. But I think that we have to continue pushing. We have to continue pushing. And when I say that, not only pushing the institutions, but pushing also ourselves, pushing and questioning our intent and the impact of our actions, right? I'm personally trying to further, an academic practice with OCAD University, in which we can begin to help students question their own identity, how they self-identify, and most importantly, how that identity is reflected in their actions, in their behaviors, in what they opt to do on a day-to-day basis. And that's a challenge for the instructors as well. You cannot, to Armando's point, you cannot teach that if you cannot practice it yourself, right? You teach through a practice, right? And so I would just, it's complicated, and I don't know if I contribute much to this conversation. I hope I do, but I would just say, basically, we have to walk the talk.
Thank you. Armando, would you like to?
Yes, this is a question that I always have in mind, right? Because we do have a lot of privilege, particularly in the positions that we are and being in the global north. And for those of us who work as well in Latin America or in other parts of the world, the global south, this is something that, like, to me, it's so important to keep in mind. And, I always think of the words of Silvia Rivera Costicanquia as well, like criticizing the colonial gurus, right? And how we, as well as brown people, we can go and we can also become extractivists, and we can take that knowledge. And that's something that, to me, it's, like, I'm always afraid, and I'm always constantly trying to stop and think, am I doing this? When I'm going, down there and working with communities I work with, even though I belong to, like, most of these communities, I still need to make sure that everyone understands as well. And I try to be very clear, because, I try to talk to people and say, well, you are doing this work here. I might, publish, I might write about it, and I will benefit from it. And I need to make sure that also these communities that are down there and the communities I'm working with are going to benefit from this, that it's not just me, right? Because we're all of this work that we do, we always benefit from it. But how are we giving back to those communities? That's something that's really important to me. So something that I always try to make sure is that everyone who's involved in my projects gets paid. Because we can't just keep bringing people into because they're from marginalized communities, because we want to make room, because we want their voices to be heard, if we're not going to pay for their expertise, if we're not going to recognize their expertise. Everyone needs to know this. Like I said, everyone needs to get paid. I also try to create those bridging between communities, but also between institutions and academics or publications. So I try to see if, some of the people that I'm working with, can also be part of. Sometimes I receive invitations to, publish in books or something. So to bring also those people now, really great as well with an academic, Monica Patterson from Carleton University. She agreed to cover the translation costs as well for a few of the people that I was able to reach out and to contribute for a book that she's editing. And so, because that's also one of the challenges, right? That, we get to publish because we get to write in English, but a lot of the people that we're working with, they don't feel comfortable writing in English. So making sure that we can negotiate those things as well. So making room for all those other voices that is not just always us. So I'm presenting, for instance, again, like the project that I talked about right now, the exhibition in El Salvador. I'm presenting it again this week at the Canadian Museums Association annual conference, and I'm bringing the two local curators as well, so they can speak about the work that they've done. So it's not just always me talking on behalf, and it's not always just me taking credit for the work. Building capacity is something that I'm always thinking in the projects that I do. So for that project in El Salvador, for instance, I made sure to put together a team that was South. So I brought a lot of Latin American people that I work with to make sure that the team and the people in El Salvador who didn't have the skills to develop an exhibition of the type that we're doing could also develop those skills through the process. So then they don't need to be bringing me down there, because I am from El Salvador originally, but I haven't been there in 22 years. I don't have the local knowledge. I don't live the day-to-day there. So it's better that local curators are the ones who are doing these projects, right? There's no need to bring me if we can create that capacity. The same here, with the Toronto History Museums, doing the same. Always, every project needs to have a component of capacity building, so the communities that we're working with can continue to be sustainable on their own, and that we don't have to be always there. So there are many other things that we can talk about, but I'll stop there.
Sorry. Going back sort of to the first question that it was asked about how the engagement with decolonial practices and within the educational curriculum, that is it's very complex. And as Armando has stated, and Rodrigo also, I'm going to just also add to the fact that I have decided to work in projects that they will end up as an open source platform, that it would engage in accessibility. And because I have noticed from my previous experience is that institutions, they want to have that impact of decolonizing, but as Armando said, some of them, they don't want to do it insightly first. And the second part is that it has been hard to get paid for those for doing that, because it entitles such an extensive time and energy, and also you want to do it in a way that you're engaging with the realities of the community, not just from a position of commodity. And in terms of the second question, that it was about, ¿cómo se dice? Sorry again.
Privilege.
Privilege, that word, privilege. Yes, I acknowledge the privilege that I made some. It's very complex either way, but for me, I always question my intent. It always, and place myself of why am I doing this and who it's benefiting from this? And also, how can I share this benefit that I have and that I'm having by, for example, making this finding aid for the Montgomery collection. It has been upon me to also search for other inquiries of how to create a finding aid that it engage with every level of community, at least. For me, accessibility is very important. It comes from a very personal space, because growing up, public school, they tend to lack in accessibility, and being in this position and looking back and seeing that I can work in what I struggled a few years ago about accessibility. So I always just I place my intent and I just think about sharing knowledge and how can we exchange with that. Yeah, that's it.
So thank you so much. I would like to end the forum for today. We have another one coming up in about an hour. So thank you so much, Rodrigo, Armando, and Luz, for your participation, for your presentations. Such important work that you are sharing with us today. And thank you for the opportunity to share this with you, to our community.